And we are live.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to 10 Tips for Writing Better Technical English at Engineer Cafe. My name's Jackson, and I'm here with Lori.
Hi.
All right, so I guess we'll start by talking a little bit about what we're hoping to do today. So these tips are to help you write simple, clear English. And the other goal is to work on noticing some issues in writing that might confuse people. The general focus is on software documentation, such as anything from code comments to tutorials, really. And I'll also talk a little bit about research and how research documents, like studies, have a few different requirements that are a bit more picky, unfortunately, than technical writing. So, Laurie, you're an engineer.
Yep.
Have you taken any training in technical writing before?
Yeah, I've never had any formal training in terms of that. You know, I have a lot of experience actually in writing things, but it comes from a working engineer perspective.
Yeah.
So obviously pull requests, comments, commit messages. There's so many places where we have to use a little bit of English to communicate. But I think most people don't get much training.
Yeah, and myself as well. I mean, my background is in science, so through university, I wasn't taking English or tech writing courses either. So I think a lot of people learn it on the job, but thankfully I've done some work that allowed me to learn a bit more about communicating, I guess. So we'll talk next a little bit about why this is useful. So using clear English in technical communications is helpful for beginners who aren't at the same experience level as you. One thing I think that people often forget is that it's also very useful for non-native English speakers. And even experts who do know what you're talking about will be able to read documentation faster and be thankful, basically be thankful for that, even if they do have a lot of experience in the field.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that when documentation is really clearly written, it just makes working with a library or a framework or a programming language much easier because it's just quicker to understand what's going on.
And definitely developers have a reputation for not wanting to read long paragraphs.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So there's a few similarities with code here, actually. So if your documentation is clear and short, it's easy to read. And it's also easier to update. So if you can manage to be very concise, you can have documentation that has less points of failure, which is obviously something you want with code as well. And I just want to point out that by writing in simple English, you're helping your readers, not being condescending. So we'll talk a little bit later about vocabulary and stuff. And my own personal view is the simpler the better. And I hope that's a useful strategy overall.
Right.
So I'll quickly mention where I'm coming from with this. So I studied biology and pharmacology. I've edited over 400 studies for universities and drug companies. And I've written and edited documentation for 4 different tech companies. So these tips are some of my personal favorites. I'm definitely not the boss of English, and I'm definitely not your boss. So these aren't rules. You can pick what you like and use what you like. And I guess next I'll talk very briefly about grammar and how that fits in here. So my own view is that bad grammar can cause problems. Actually, I guess that's universal here. But my view with grammar is that you should do your best. Use a spell checker or a grammar checker, whatever tools are available. What I think sometimes we all forget is that good grammar probably won't solve all of your documentation problems, and that sometimes grammatically correct documents are just bad. So obviously we should still ask, is this correct? Especially typos are just a pain. But I think we also need to ask, does this make sense? Could this be confusing to anybody? Or could we make this shorter? And obviously we'll talk about some strategies. to do that. Yeah, so as I mentioned, as in terms of grammar, documents with correct English can still be terrible, especially if they're, for example, way too long. And there's also good news that non-native English speakers can write great documentation. And in terms of, for example, some complicated tenses or people who don't have a full grasp of everything you can do with English grammar, one good thing is that you can, and you probably should, write documentation using simple grammar. And there's at least one tip that we'll mention later that talks about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think this idea about non-native English speakers is a really important one, because in general, in the world of software and science, English is the language everyone uses for communication. So I've read tons of great documentation written by non-native speakers, and it's perfectly fine. And it's simple, clear, easy to understand, doesn't use any complicated words that it doesn't need to. So yeah, I think don't worry about native versus non-native too much.
Definitely. Okay, so I'll give some credit to sources next. So some of this material, actually a decent chunk of this material, is from the Google Developer Documentation Style Guide, and also from the Google Technical Writing 1 course. These aren't the only resources out there, but they're both very good. In particular, I really like Google's style guide. There's many style guides out there, way too many to mention, but Google might be the most used one that's specific for developers.
Can you just explain what a style guide is?
Yeah, so these basically give some guidelines for writing. I mean, there's like the Chicago Manual of Style, and they'll talk about things like, for example, commas, some picky aspects of grammar, for example, how to capitalize a title. And then, obviously, if you're a developer, looking at a style guide that, say, reporters might use wouldn't necessarily be the best choice. They may be useful. I mean, probably they all have something useful. But there's a Google one, there's a Microsoft one, I think there's an Apple one that have some specific recommendations for their working either in general with coding or with their own product. And actually, I have some screenshots from the Google Developer Style Guide later. So it's pretty user-friendly. You don't need to be like an English major or an even native English speaker to make use of it.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, if you're looking to learn more, definitely the Google Technical Writing 1 course can be done, I think, in no more than a couple hours. So, and it's free and it's open source as well. Okay, so the format for this seminar training is I have a handful of tips, and for each one, we'll look at a sample text. We'll try to find the problem. Laurie will try to find the problem. and
Laurie and the people watching the current live stream will be trying to find the problem.
Yes.
So if you do notice any problems, put it in the chat.
Oh yes, please do.
And we can interact like that.
And then for each one, we'll move to the corresponding tip and how we can make possible improvements. So you could use this sort of strategy in looking at your own writing. Definitely for today. General focus is on looking at things basically one sentence at a time, saying like, is this good, and how can we improve this? Okay, so we'll go to the first one. So example 1 is, so just so you know, the words in blue are hints. So the text is, in order to use the functionality of this library, you must install a number of packages. After finalizing the configuration, you can proceed. So, Laurie, any idea of there's one particular weak point here.
So, this sentence, you're saying that all the words in blue have the same problem?
Yes.
Or the same type of problem?
Yes.
Okay, so in order to use the functionality of this library, you must install a number of packages. I feel like I could have read this in some documentation somewhere. I feel like I've seen it before.
Developers love the word functionality.
Functionality, yes. Finalizing things like configuration. Yeah, these are pretty common words to see. So it's pretty hard to see a problem. So do they have simpler ways to say them?
Yes, that is it. So they're not bad. Looking at this quickly, I don't see any mistakes per se, but we can use simpler words for all of these terms. And
can I
should
guess some simpler words?
Sure, go.
Before we get so. See, functionality to me seems like such a common word. It's hard to imagine. So in order to, the functionality of this library, couldn't you just say use this library?
Yes, yeah, that's for sure. I think I put features.
Features.
Yeah. So the definitely dropping words in bulk is one strategy you can use for sure.
You just cut out all the words, make it shorter.
And like after finalizing the configuration could be after you're done, depending on how formal your documentation is.
Let's take a look at.
So tip number 1 is use simple words. So in general, shorter words are easier, more common words. There are a handful of resources saying, oh, here's a list of complicated words, here's the simpler terms. I think in many cases we can sort of pick them out. And for example, configuration, it's not terribly uncommon, but we could say, okay, this is a lot of syllables. So we could probably come up with something shorter. So one of my recommendations is if you're struggling to simplify technical words, focus on the non-technical words. So actually, if we go back, so say, like you said, it may be difficult to come up with an alternative for functionality, but you could probably figure out for in order to, that maybe we can just say to instead. So even if your domain specific words are tough, you can always look at the other ones. So, and then another example is, for example, don't say subsequently. You can just say after or next or that sort of thing. And so this is possible even for complex topics. I promise, if you try hard, you can do it. And I have a quite good example that I can show you. So this is an XKCD comic written by a very brilliant guy who I think worked for NASA. So this is a huge image. I'm just showing the top. And he's basically shown all of the parts of the Saturn V rocket, explaining what they are and in some cases how they work, using only the top 1,000 words in the English language. So I'll quickly scroll down and you can see the whole image.
So this is a rocket.
Yeah.
Saturn V rocket. Oh, wow.
And so obviously rocket science is notoriously complicated, but his style of writing is just brilliant. So yeah, he's only used the top 1,000 words, or top 1,000 most common words in the English language. So at the bottom he's written, this end should point toward the ground if you want to go to space. If it starts pointing toward space, you are having a bad problem and you will not go to space today. So I love this. I think it's great writing, and I think a lot of people could read through this very easily. I took a crack at imagining how we might write this more formally, just out of habit.
Yeah.
So thinking something like, orientation of the rocket during takeoff is critical. Inversion could be catastrophic, resulting in mission failure, and so on. So sometimes we just kind of pick more complicated words out of habit.
Yeah, I definitely think words like inversion, catastrophic are a lot more complicated, for sure.
But it's interesting because something like a bad problem is also very clear. So we'll go back to our first example and we can look at one way we could edit this. So the edited sentence is, to use the features of this library, you must install a few packages. After finishing this setup, you can continue. So it's definitely shorter, and I think the words are a bit easier to understand, even for a native speaker. You can imagine scanning that a lot faster. All right, so next we'll go to our second example. The late 1950s was a key era for programming languages because IBM introduced Fortran in 1957 and John McCarthy introduced Lisp the following year, which gave programmers both an iterative way of solving problems and a recursive way. And the only thing I've highlighted in blue here is the period, or full stop at the end.
Okay.
That's it. So that's your hint.
So you're saying this is, we could improve this somehow.
Yes.
So
there's one big thing that jumps out at me.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking about the last hint in the way that, maybe words like iterative and recursive are a kind of domain language. So in a way they're complicated, but they're the best way to say that idea. So I don't think it's that.
Yeah, I can't think of another way to say recursive offhand.
Without just explaining what recursive means. So how about, it's a pretty long sentence.
Yes, yeah,
right?
that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Because this could be written for an audience of developers or engineers.
Definitely.
So it's possible that recursive is like completely standard in the field. But yeah, even then, it's a bit long, I would say.
Yeah.
So tip 2 is use short sentences. So the easiest way to do this is to focus each sentence on a single idea. And as you can see in the example, the topic was kind of all over.
It was, talking about many ideas.
Yeah. So you can set your own limits for this. One limit is considered to be 25 words per sentence. The last example was 38 words. It's probably too long, even for technical writing. It is said that there's an average of 15 to 20 words per sentence is a good target. In my view, even less is fine. I'm down for quite short sentences.
Yeah.
So I'll just show how we might be able to break that down on the next slide. So the top paragraph is just the original. Well, the paragraph is one sentence. So basically, without changing this much, we can just separate this into separate ideas. So we now have 4 sentences.
Okay. So we've got the late 1950s was a key era for programming languages, full stop.
Yeah.
IBM introduced Fortran in 1957. Another, John McCarthy invented Lisp the following year. And then by the late 1950s, programmers could solve problems iteratively or recursively. So like one idea per sentence.
Yeah. And as you can see, to me, it doesn't seem like overly dumbed down. It's really the same information. It's just kind of bite-sized. Because you can imagine if you were unsure about a word or want to just scan back, you can just kind of look at one sentence at a time. So for the next tip, we'll actually use these same examples again.
Oh no.
So there's no quiz for the next one.
I feel like they're getting harder and harder.
No, overall they don't increase in difficulty, I think.
Sure.
So tip number 3 that you can do, you may not know that you can do this, is you can actually test the readability of text. So you can calculate how easy it is to read your document. Most of the formulas use the length of the sentence and the the length of the sentence and the length of the words. These have been tested a bunch by smart researchers, so it's much smarter than me, and are pretty validated as a way to measure roughly how approachable a certain text is. So there's a whole bunch of free online tools. Microsoft Word also has the feature to do this.
Oh, yeah.
I think you can set it to pop up at the end of your spell check, actually.
Oh, okay.
I haven't used it in Word yet. But so I popped the last text into this readability calculator online. And we can, so next we'll go to looking at how they scored. So US grade 8, or around 13 to 14 years old, is actually a great target. That's the target, I believe, that they use for GitLab at their documentation. And although we say grade 8, their audience is developers. So it doesn't mean that you're being condescending, or it doesn't limit what you can say, but that does kind of give you a push to say things in a easy to understand way. So it broadens your audience a bit, especially again, if people are not native speakers. If your audience aren't native speakers of English. So if we look at the scores, the first long sentence, scores is a grade 12, 17 to 18 years old. And when we split this up into multiple sentences, now this, I think it scored like grade 7.7. And we would expect that somebody 13 years old might be able to understand this. So it's interesting that we can say the same information and just kind of give chunks in a way that are easier to understand.
I definitely notice if it's a topic that I'm not familiar with, having longer sentences means I have to hold more new information in my head, and I have to kind of maybe jump back a little bit more to work out what's going on. So I definitely agree with this point. It looks like good advice.
And it's cool as well because, I mean, I mentioned like the number of words in a sentence. I obviously, nobody counts the words as they write. So it's cool that there are some tools that you can use to sort of check that.
So those tools are based on length of word and length of sentence?
So yes, the score for the US grade, the most common, the calculator on wordcalc.com, what is it called? The Flesch-Kincaid grade level uses the length of the sentence and the length of the words. So they don't actually use like a database of words and like this is at this level. This word you can use, this word you can't. It's much more mathematical than I expected, but it does seem to work well. So that's kind of cool. Okay, so our next example, I'll read this out. Jeff Dean invented MapReduce. Oh, this is fake, by the way.
Okay.
It's a sample text.
Yes.
Jeff Dean invented MapReduce in 1693, implementing the algorithm on a silicon-based computer fabricated from beach sand, wax paper, a quill pen, and a toaster oven. This version of MR held several world performance records until 2014.
So apart from the very strange...
insane algorithm,
the strange example you've chosen. Let's see. So the hint is the blue text.
Yes.
So, I mean, if anyone watching has an idea of what the problem is, you could put a message in the chat. I'm thinking... so... Is it something as simple as MapReduce and MR a very long way away from each other?
You're on the right track.
So is it because when we said MR, we didn't define it?
Exactly. That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
So that brings us to tip 4. Tip 4 is check your abbreviations. So you definitely want to define abbreviations, such as MR, the first time you use them, or the first time you use the term. Obviously, we have the exception for common words like API, URL, and USB, which usually don't need to be explained. But actually, depending on your audience, not everybody would know what an API is. Maybe URL. URL is pretty common, I guess. So consider your audience as well. And then if you only use the term a few times, this is a sample, so we don't know how long that text would have been. If it's only used a few times, you can also just skip an abbreviation. I've seen more than a few scientific papers that are just full of abbreviations. It can be very hard to keep track of which is which.
Yeah. I think I remember when I first studied sort of networking, and there were a lot of 4-letter abbreviations that were both, GSMR and GPRS, and they're all very, very close. So it got very hard to remember.
Yeah, and so you can also balance that with how long it is.
Yeah.
So in this case, MapReduce isn't very long. So the author, or if we were editing or writing this, we might be able to say, MapReduce looks like one word, so maybe we'll just spell it out.
Yeah, not too bad.
Looking back at the example, so we could change this in 2 ways. The first is we could mention that MR means MapReduce the first time, and then just use MR the second time. And then the other option is just to spell out the term both times. So this is particularly important if it's an abbreviation that you've come up with yourself, such as, some part of some tool or some project or a paper. So, because, I guess individual or personal abbreviations seem to be very common in research. So actually, I'll mention one other thing about research. So if you're doing research and hoping to publish something, I have a tip for you. Most publishers consider an abstract and a research paper to be separate texts. So if you define an abbreviation in an abstract for a research paper, you still have to define it again in the main text. I think that's maybe not that common knowledge.
I think it's not obvious. I wouldn't have known that. Is it because many people, I guess, read abstracts on their own just to kind of get over it, and then they read papers on their own?
Yeah, so definitely, in some cases, people don't have access to the full paper, so the abstract is all you get. So abbreviations are also discouraged in abstracts. But then I suppose because the abstract is a summary of the main paper, you may not read the idea is that you might read the paper without reading the abstract first. Although you'd probably want to read the abstract to see if you want to read the paper.
But you never know.
No.
You might read them separately. You might read a bunch of abstracts and then read the pile of papers the next week.
Yes. But so I can't really speak to the typical scientist reading habits, but definitely that is the publishing convention. Okay, so let's go next to example 5. By default, this app only uses Wi-Fi and cellular data is disabled. You can enable switching from Wi-Fi to mobile data in the settings.
So I think I got this one.
Okay.
So I guess you want us to be consistent.
Yes, that's it. And definitely the cellular data and mobile data is more egregious than the formatting of Wi-Fi.
Why is that worse?
Because it's a different word. Because I think most people, including me, if I was reading and saw Wi-Fi capitalized properly and Wi-Fi not capitalized properly, I might not notice. It probably
you'd think they're the same word, no problem. You wouldn't think they're two things.
But you could imagine, say, if we're talking about algorithms or something, that using two words for the same thing could be pretty confusing.
I think maybe this is an interesting one where it's writing and conversation is quite different. Because often in a conversation with someone who's maybe having trouble understanding, you might use multiple words to help them follow the conversation. But in writing, they might look like they mean different things or have special meanings. So quite different.
It's possible in writing, I suppose, if you have multiple words that you want to mention for a term, you can include them at the beginning, like cellular data. I mean, this is a fairly easy one, but cellular data or mobile, also known as mobile data. And then after that, just use one. So yes, tip number 5 is use terms consistently. So generally, if the reader has to switch between, say, terms like cellular data and mobile data, it's a little bit of extra mental work. I did pick a fairly simple one on purpose, but we say it's best in technical writing to use only one term for each thing. So this also applies to the reader. So in some cases, documentation will say things like the user, or say if it's an API, developers, or they, or people. In most cases, it's best to just say you, and that's you're directly addressing the audience. So I think a natural question is, I'm saying, okay, you need to pick between cellular data and mobile data. Like, how would you go about deciding? So I have 3 recommendations there. So the first one is you can check a style guide. So as I mentioned, the Google style guide, the smart people at Google have thought about this and come up with a recommendation, which we'll look at. The second thing you can do is check which term is more common, just in 2 different fields that I'll show. And the third thing you can do is do whatever you want and just record the decision and try to stick to it consistently, either within one document or between documents. So I'll give a bit more information on the style guide and checking which term is more common in the wild. So for the style guide, for example, if we looked at the Google developer documentation style guide, they have a list of words and their own recommendations. As you can see, they're pretty tech specific. So I just grabbed what they have for cellular data and for Wi-Fi. So actually, I don't know the reason, but they recommend not using cellular data. And they say instead use mobile data. So that's, at least we can just limit thinking about that.
I wonder if maybe just people talking about cell phones is a bit less common now because of, I guess, many devices have mobile data. Tablets, pocket Wi-Fi kind of things.
I think mobile devices is an encouraged term over cell phones, maybe for that reason.
Right.
And then for Wi-Fi, I think this is just the established spelling for Wi-Fi. So again, like this isn't a rule. Like Google's not your boss, but it does give you the option to say, okay, they've come up with some rationale, and we can just use that.
I'm a big fan of hyphens when they come up, but maybe I'll talk about that at the end if we have a chance.
It's funny because I'm not a huge fan of optionally hyphenating terms, but it's possible that some, I guess, consortium has said, no, this is the way to spell Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I get the feeling that's maybe the reason. Because I feel like many people would probably do all lowercase, no hyphen. Oh yeah. It's kind of like my default.
That would be my default to type out like the Wi-Fi is broken, for sure. And so I'll show my other tip for how to pick which terms are good to use. When we say check which term is more common, you can use Google Trends to see what people are searching for, which I think is a good snapshot of like general language. So on the left, you can see a map here. So the mobile data is in blue, cellular data is in red, so that you can see worldwide on average. Sorry, this is for Google Trends. On average, the term mobile data is searched for much more often. Actually, everywhere but Turkey.
What kind of Turkey?
Yeah, Turkey. Turkey loves the term cellular data. I have obviously no idea why. But especially just in like, I think general tech writing, this is a great thing to check. Just like what is the word that people are using when they're talking to Google. And if you're looking for published research, I've used this many times when editing manuscripts. You can search Google Scholar and see how many times that word has been published in a manuscript. So as well in research, mobile data outnumbers cellular data by about 10 to 1. So I think mobile data sort of wins everywhere.
That's a really useful tool, being able to get a bit of feedback from, if you've got 2 words, 3 words, and you're not sure which is quite the best choice. I like it.
And it's also cool because I've had times where I'm working on a document and something just doesn't look right. I'm like, I don't, this term look like I understand, but it doesn't feel right. You can also take a look either just at search results or at published research and see like, okay, what term seems to be more popular? Or what's the kind of general term?
Yeah.
Okay, so if we go back to our original text, we can edit this and just use the same spelling for Wi-Fi and the same term, mobile data, each time. And there could be something said for like removing words from these 2 sentences too. Okay, so I'll move to our next example. This is a fun one. I think this is a fun one. So these are sort of 2 alternate wordings. When a user signs up, they will receive a password. And if a user has signed up, they would have received a password.
So the main difference is kind of the tense you're using and the kind of conditional versus using...
Yeah, so and I'll say these are both not my preferred wording.
Okay. Are we saying one is better or they're both bad?
I don't like either.
Okay. Let me try and have a think about why. To me, the second one seems really quite complicated because I have to think kind of back in time. If a user has signed up, they would have. But what are they doing now? I'm not sure. So I find the second one confusing. When a user signs up, they will receive a password. Sounds better to me.
It is probably better.
But I'm trying to think what the problem might be or other ways. I guess there's a level of certainty there.
That's interesting. That's not actually what I was thinking.
Oh, really? Because, I mean, it's hiding a lot of complexity of things that could go wrong. They can't log into their email. They can't get their login token. I don't know that.
Yes, actually, I didn't think of the level of certainty. But so what I'm going for here is that whenever possible, just use the most simple tense. And so will isn't terrible, but we can also drop it and not change the meaning really.
Of course.
So tip number 6 is use present tense when you can. So generally when explaining how something works, use the present tense. Because I've noticed, particularly with will, if somebody starts a paragraph saying this will happen, suddenly you have a flurry of this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, and it becomes like 5, 6 or more times that you can just drop that word. And same thing goes for would. Obviously, like these words have like a grammatical function, but when we say how something works, we're kind of talking in general terms and can just speak as if it's now. One obvious exception is if you're really talking about the future. So if we say the server will be down, that's clear. That's a great sentence. And it's not the same meaning as the server is down. But when we talk about, I'm imagining something like code comments. When you're just saying this happens. You don't need to say this will happen when you run the code. So if we go back to the example, what I would change this to is just when a user signs up, they receive a password. And that's, at worst, we just save the word, the extra word that we would have with will. Okay.
So that one's kind of, just removing that one word will. But maybe if, like you say, if it's 5, 6, 7 times in one paragraph, makes it a little bit shorter, a little bit simpler.
And definitely, if somebody, for example, said will at the start of a paragraph and then went back to present tense, it seems a bit weird.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll go to the next one. Example 7. The service is queried and an acknowledgement is sent.
I know this one. So this is my least favorite thing to see. So I don't know how many people are watching right now. We've got a couple of people maybe, but this grammar pattern we're looking at is the passive, right? And well, I remember in like high school science, they always told us to use the passive. And then when I got to university, they said, no, just use the active. It's more clear.
Unfortunately, academia has still not fully decided what they want. So
I think computer science is probably a bit more advanced than some other fields where...
So I will mention the sort of academic perspective in a bit.
Yes.
So you're correct. The tip here is we should probably use the active voice here. So just in case, I'll give a little bit of an explanation here. So the first sample sentence here is the verbs are passive. The second sample sentence, the verbs are active. So the first is code is interpreted by Python, but code is compiled by C++. The second sentence is Python interprets code, but C++ compiles code. So the first thing we notice is that the active is just like less words, which is already a thumbs up. And I find like the passive verbs just sound a bit weird. So anyway, something is done by something is usually what you would look for to understand or to identify the passive voice. So there did also used to be sort of a rumor that this was incorrect. So it's not the sentence is, the grammar is fine. It just sounds kind of strange.
What do you mean? Which one is incorrect?
So I believe it was the guide by Strunk and White.
The famous style guide.
Yes, they said don't use passive verbs, and then they gave some examples that weren't passive verbs. So that was kind of a tip that had room to grow.
Okay.
say that. So it's not so much that it's wrong, but it's that we can do a bit better. So definitely active sentences are shorter. And they also force you to include who or what does an action. So in the example, it was like, okay, a request is sent somewhere, but we phrased it in a way that we forgot to mention who or what sends the request. And just in terms of like to a bit of a more explanation. So usually with passive sentence, you don't need to mention who does the action, which can cause confusion. If you're saying commands, like do this, like click here, that's still the active voice. It's just we don't use the subject in that sentence,
Right.
or in that case. So if we say close the window, that's the same as like you have to close the window, and so the subject is the reader, and that's still fine. There are some times that we still want to use passive voice. So one is if you want to focus on the action. So I really like these examples. These are from Google. So it's probably good to say something like over 50 conflicts were found in the file. If we say you created over 50 conflicts in the file, it's a little bit aggressive.
Right. I think if that was an automated message, it's not so bad. But if a coworker wrote this in a pull request and said, you made 10 bugs in your latest, it sounds very strong.
So it's not, there's not a ban on using the passive voice. It's just that it can, when we say like, oh, this is sent, this will be received, that sort of thing, it can be confusing.
Right.
The other time that we would definitely want to use passive voice is if we don't know the cause of something. So if we say the database was purged in January, it's unclear what the cause was, then that's probably the best way of stating that. So now I'll mention a little bit the scientific situation with passive voice. So if you're a researcher, academic journals often say, okay, you have to use the passive voice. This is usually sort of a rule for the methods section or for experimental methods. So you often see a sentence like, the samples were put in the fridge, which is probably better than, oh, a student volunteer put the samples in the fridge, or I put the samples in the fridge, because it's really not the focus of the methods. So I think they're onto something there, that it's sort of like instructions for something that have happened. So, or instructions that, like, you might repeat somebody's methods to sort of verify a study. And in that case, the passive voice isn't so bad. But there is one situation where this tends to get, in my view, kind of out of hand. When in academia, people use passive voice for their own opinions, and it starts to sound very weird. So you often see the phrase, it has been suggested, or it is thought that. And this is really common, and like native English speakers will write this. But then it's like, whose opinion is this? Who is talking? So I would definitely say, it's better to say, like, we suggest this, we think this, like this is our conclusion. And obviously research is written by humans who have thoughts about it.
Yeah, sometimes if you're reading Wikipedia, there'll be a sentence in the passive that says, it is thought that, and there's a little comment that says, this should be clarified, this should be changed.
Oh, for sure.
Because, we don't know who is doing it.
Yeah, sometimes kind of sarcastic journalism will say, like, oh, some people might suggest, or some people have suggested.
Yeah, yes.
Like, is the author suggesting this, perhaps? So in this last line is directly from Google's, I think from the technical writing training. Do we know who is doing what to whom? No. Does the passive voice somehow make the information more objective? No. So they're actually pretty strong on that. They said, if you're a publication that is promoting like extra use of the passive voice, like, please join the future and stop.
Right. Yeah.
So we'll go to the example, or back to the example. So I think it would be better to say something like, your app queries the service and the server sends an acknowledgement. And then the like direction of flow is a little bit more clear.
Yeah. Actually, so this one is slightly longer, even though, the first one is kind of shorter because we haven't said who is doing what and the objects and the subject. So
yes.
But longer is clearer in this case.
That's for sure. Yes. Sometimes, I guess if you have a passive voice and you've mentioned the doer, then it's just extra long. But sometimes it is kind of missing information from a sentence, and then there is a bit of a trade-off with your word count. So I guess it takes some practice. Yeah. Okay, so example 8, we're getting through most of them. Okay, this one is interesting. I'm interested to see if you've seen this one before. Okay, so these are two separate examples.
Okay, 2 examples.
So the first one, I'll just read the header. So to get the USB driver, follow these steps. And the second example is, here are some types of birds.
Ah, this I think I know this one, and it reminds me of a group project
Okay.
back in university. But so at the top we've got bullet points, and the bottom we've got a numbered
Yes.
list. So I guess having the numbers on the list implies an order.
It does.
That, we can't change the order. And having bullet points implies no order.
Yes.
But actually, this is steps to do something. So the top one should have an order, and the bottom one shouldn't have an order.
Yes, so that's correct. And so it's interesting for the top one, if there was perhaps two ways of doing something, we could say, do one of the following. But in this case, they should be done in order. So yeah, you're correct with that. So tip number 8 is use the right bullets. So we usually, this is at least a general tech writing convention, we usually use round bullets or another whatever symbol if the order of a list doesn't matter. And then we use numbers to show that the order is important. So readers may not notice right away, but it does kind of it's just sort of an extra indication that things happen in a certain order. So if we go back to the example, this is probably a better look. If we say, to get the USB driver, follow these steps, and then we have numbered steps. And it may even help people remember, oh, I was on step 2, or I was on step 3. And here are some types of birds. And obviously they're not in order. Now, if you were saying, oh, here are my favorite types of birds in order of how much I like them, I guess maybe a numbered list might be useful. All right, so I'm curious. So if you're writing for engineering type stuff, do you usually follow that convention? You can tell me.
I'm trying to remember. I feel like I write a lot of bullet point lists without numbers, and now you mention it, I'm starting to think a couple of them might be ordered that I should have used numbers instead.
But it's interesting too, because my tips here are not in any particular order. I guess they're sort of starting with basics, but I mean generally they can use separately. And so I was thinking now am I being misleading by numbering the tips?
Well, I would say that the reason for numbering here is so that we can reference them later.
Yes, that's right.
So it kind of gives you an out.
Okay, that's fair, yeah. Okay, so we'll go to the next one. Example 9. So this one is a little bit grammatical, but I don't think it's maybe not too tough, at least for native speakers. So if we say you can use this API to upload transactions, analyzing data, summary reports. So it kind of sounds wrong, but what's your take on that?
I think of all the ones I've seen so far, this is the one I see most often.
Yeah.
So we're looking at those 3 words: upload, analyzing, summary, and to say it simply, they don't match.
Yes, that's probably the best way to say it. So the tip that we usually call this parallel lists. So tip number 9 is use parallel lists. And I'm not a fan of describing this with a ton of grammatical words or parts of speech, but I think it's best to just say each item in a list should be similar. So they can be a noun. No, I'm using parts of speech. It could be a noun, a verb. They could also be a full sentence. And this is something to think about also if you especially if you go back and you're oh, we need to add this possibility to the list. Or so there's a few different ways of writing this, and I'm not sure if one of them is really better. But if we go back to the example, I picked out 3 possibilities. So you can use this API on the left. You can use this API for uploading transactions, analyzing data, creating summary reports. So I just wrote these are verbs with ing. We could say they're gerund forms, but then again, it's not really useful to use a grammar word. So then the middle example, they're all verbs, just plain verb. And on the right, they're all nouns. So looking at these, I don't think any one type is better or worse really, but it looks a little bit more coherent, I think, when they're the same.
Yeah, and I maybe don't think you quite mentioned it, but if you look at the top sentence, you can use this API for,
oh yes,
API to So you're matching the first sentence,
That's
the
true.
introduction of the list. Yeah, I think I see this a lot in documents, like design documents, that are written by multiple people and that have gone through a week's worth of editing by different people, adding different ideas and meetings and important stuff. But it's very easy for that process to have multiple people write those bullet points different ways.
And I think the one that is particularly hard to avoid in technical writing is if you have a list of instructions, it's hard to resist adding extra bullet points that are just pieces of information. So like this will happen in the middle, but it's like, well, it looks weird because it's not actually an instruction. So yeah, if the instructions, try to start each one with just do this, do this, do this with verbs. Okay, and that brings us to our last example. This is an interesting one. You may import carambola data via your configuration file or dynamically at runtime. This may be a security risk.
So the highlighted part is this.
Yep.
This may be a security risk. So you may import carambola data via your configuration file or dynamically at runtime. This may be a security risk. So I might read that and think, oh, importing dynamically at runtime is a security risk, or something else.
Yeah. So that's
is that it?
Yes, that is. I guess I could have also highlighted the word or. So tip number 10 is use this carefully. And it's not just this. It could be any pronouns. Like it's often in technical stuff, it, this, that, or they. It could also be like people's names. And then like he or she or whatever afterwards. So if you use a word like that, make sure the meaning is clear, especially if it's at the beginning of a sentence. So in this case, the sentence started with this, so it's best to look at the sentence before and be like, do we know what this is? It can also sound weird logically if you have like a long sentence and then say like, this means. It's like, well, which part are you interpreting? So if we go on to sort of look at how we could rewrite this, there's three possibilities here, at least three possibilities here. So we could say importing data via your configuration file may be a security risk, or maybe that wasn't the problem. Importing data dynamically may be a security risk, or maybe both were an issue. So we could say both may be security risks.
Yeah, I certainly see this pattern a little bit. I can't think of a great technical example right now, but I often see the example where the second sentence, you need kind of domain knowledge to decide whether what the pronoun is. So like a non-technical example would be Manchester United beat Arsenal in a football match. They were dejected. And you have to know what the word dejected means to understand who they is.
Oh, true.
And if you don't know what dejected means, the second sentence is kind of hard to understand. And if you change it to they were ecstatic, you've switched the meaning of they. And so I see this pattern a lot in technical writing where it's okay if you understand it, but as soon as you don't understand it, then it falls apart even worse.
So I guess it's a little bit of a logical thing, because the original sentence, I think grammatically is fine. It's just it's not great. So I have one extra bonus tip.
Bonus tip.
I'm wondering if you've heard of this or not.
Okay.
So you may not remember all of these tips, but there is one interesting thing that you can do. You can use a linter for text, or I guess code as text, for writing. So there's open source tools like Veil that you can use to check your writing. Have you heard of Veil before?
I've not heard of Veil.
So it runs in the command line. If you're good at setting up scripts and stuff, you can use this as part of a publishing pipeline. So this screenshot is showing some suggestions, errors and warnings based on Microsoft's style guide for some text that's been put into it. So basically it says like this line, this character, we're starting at this character. Oh, looks like you used passive voice. It's pointed out, the word additional is like a really complicated way to say more. And there's a few other suggestions. I mean, I've used Veil with the Google style guide, and then another set of rules called Write Good. But it's quite cool that, again, it's free and it's open source. And it allows you to like kind of just bring in a bunch of advice without memorizing. And it also, like, I guess Microsoft Style Guide has a recommendation of keeping sentences under 30 words. So, because again, like, we don't count words per sentence when we write. It's something that if you can automate checking that, much better.
Awesome.
So to summarize, we'll go back again. So the full list of tips is use simple words, use short sentences. I would say that's probably the best one. If you don't remember anything else, shorter sentences will be better. Test your readability. Check your abbreviations. Use terms consistently. Use present tense. Use active voice. Use the right bullets. Use parallel lists. Use this carefully. And the bonus tip is use a linter, and that'll help you with, I think, most of the tips we have.
Excellent.
And that is the end. So
yeah.
Thank you for listening, guys. Any questions? Laurie, any questions?
Yeah. So if anyone's watching the stream right now, just pop a question in the chat. We have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, thanks again for giving this great talk.
No problem.
Excellent timing as well for the slot. That worked out perfectly. I have a bunch of questions. Where to start? I guess I was interested in Veil, and I wondered, you mentioned Google Trends. Do you have any other tools you think are really useful in your writing? Like sites, tools, anything
There's
like
a few. I didn't mention in here, I sometimes just use Grammarly, the free version, just to look for errors, especially if a document's long.
Yeah, Grammarly is a grammar checker. If you don't know it, grammarly.com. It's quite useful.
Yeah, so basically, like, I didn't want to make all the tools like grammar, but if your document is full of spelling errors and full of like weird grammar mistakes, it will be unclear. So Grammarly is pretty good. If the document's really private, it does get uploaded, so maybe not.
Yeah, I know some companies it's against the rules.
Yeah,
and especially the extensions that might be uploading all of your text. You might want to be a little bit careful about using extensions like that.
There's one called Hemingway that I haven't used, and it helps you just write simpler English. I think it like harasses you about word length and stuff as you write, which apparently some people use to build habits.
Okay, so like while they're writing, they kind of build a habit to use lots of short sentences.
Those are the only ones that come to mind.
I want to ask about dictionaries, actually. I'm a big fan of dictionaries. I use many different dictionaries. I wondered if you had any favorite dictionaries and why you like to use them.
Oh, that's a good question. I actually, so for work, I've used both US and UK English, and sometimes I'm like, I don't remember where I'm going. So I just use onelook.com. And it searches a whole bunch of dictionaries. Onelook.com. And that one can be interesting too if the term is kind of uncommon. You can see, okay, this only popped up on a few pages. If it's not in many dictionaries, it's probably not a great choice. But I don't know, sometimes it's just a really specialized word, and that's your own choice.
Yeah.
So, I mean, some companies will pick like, oh, okay, we use this dictionary, we use this style guide. I'm not sure tech companies are as picky about like, okay, it needs to be Merriam-Webster. But I guess on that note, it is useful to look at like, okay, are we using UK spelling? Are we using US spelling? Obviously, I like to use Canadian spelling, but it's a mix of both.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, usually we use UK spelling for the daily stuff, and American spelling for more technical words.
Oh, that's very strange.
Yes, and it's so often for academic journals, they say you can use US or UK spelling, but not a mixture of both, and that is aimed squarely at us.
So yeah, I guess be consistent
Yeah.
in general is a
Yeah,
good
yeah.
rule. If you pick a style, stick with the style.
So that one I think does make sense, because also if you're using it like a term that is US specific or UK specific, and somebody does like a control F, you don't want them finding half the results.
Yeah,
You'd want them to
that's
find.
true.
So that can be useful for like as you pick a style for your project or organization or whatever.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm thinking about dictionaries. I often like to have a quick look at the Oxford Learner's Dictionary, because it's just a very simple dictionary. But just because it's simple doesn't mean it's bad. It has almost any word you would ever use. Shows British and American differences very easily.
Oh, really?
Gives you the pronunciation, the audio. Gives really, really like good examples that you can follow without giving you too much information.
Oh, cool.
So I often recommend Oxford Learner's Dictionary. It's free online.
Oh, nice.
Really easy to use. I haven't seen any questions from the stream. I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to say.
I think that covers.
Yeah. I think it's really. I'm really glad we got to do this stream. Maybe in the future we might do a Japanese version or another version where we do something slightly different, a different topic, and that would be amazing. So keep an eye on the Engineer Cafe website and the Compass page. But thank you for everyone listening now or in the future.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop the stream there.